My name is Jorge Castañeda. I'm a PhD student at the Doctorate in Cultural and Global Criminology. I'm currently associated to Utrecht University and the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. This is part of my PhD dissertation. Um, the title is Piojos Padrinos from Subservient and Subordinate to a Dominating Local Masculinity. In order to explain what my research topic is, I need to first point out that there's two things, a foreground and a background to it. As the title states, the foreground refers to masculinity and the possibility of inverting hierarchies. So we have gender at the foreground, and the background is refers to or relates to violence and space. So those are the two elements, and in order to understand how masculinity uh, is inverted, I need to describe what the relationship is between the not masculinity is inverted, but the hierarchies are inverted. I need to describe what the relationship is between foreground and background. And uh, throughout this presentation, what I will demonstrate is that in the process by which individuals are able to invert hierarchies relationally, they can draw from space and use certain characteristics of space. But before that can happen, space has to be associated or attached to specific meaning, and this is where we get violence and the relationship between violence and space. So let me just begin. The presentation is composed of 4 parts. We have first, I will talk about the context. I will state a research question, talk about the theoretical framework from which I analyze this, and then I will describe the data collection methods, concentrate on the findings, and finally draw some conclusions. So very quickly, let me just get right into it and state that for the past decade, Mexico has experienced a steep increase in the rate of the murder rate. Now, this began in 2006 when the federal government initiated or began a campaign against organizations connected to the smuggling of drugs to the United States. Now, the process or the phenomenon has not stayed stable throughout these 10 years. Nonetheless, it has stayed consistent. So how can we understand this? How are people coping with violence? And what is allowing for this violence to stay consistently above previous levels? One approach is to explain the violence in terms of, or by using, constructing a causal chain, a chain of causality, in which violence is the result of structural strain, particularly poverty and the lack of employment. This is exactly the approach that a team of researchers from Mexico publishing in Spanish have or use in a recent paper. They construct a chain of causality. They have lack of employment, poverty, violence, and it's violence that is shaping masculinity. Now, this is an interesting connection, which has been the connection that I've been working on for the last year in my project. The issue here is that is the way that they frame this relationship and how they conceptualize uh, masculinity. As you can see, there's a one directional relationship between violence and gender. It's violence that shapes gender. And what type of gender is it? Well, it's the masculinity towards which a very specific population of individuals conform their behavior. Who do they study? Well, they study the individuals that are hired employed by the organized criminal associations to follow the movements of the authorities and antagonistic groups. But what does the theory say? Well, Connell and Messersmith define hegemonic masculinity in terms of the configuration of practices that legitimates the domination of men over women and of women and of men over other men. This is a relational concept that's constructed in everyday interactions, and they draw from Zimmerman and West to make this proposition. And we see that there's a role, a specific role that violence plays in this model, and what it boils down to, what it what it consists of, is that it's an element, it's a resource that can be employed to assert that domination. In fact, Messersmith indicates that this can also be understood as a behavior, violence can be understood as a behavior that is employed in the construction of a localized masculinity. Here I have to underline the relational character and the fact that the relationship between masculinity and violence is not one directional. There are alternative frameworks, for example, the sex role theory approach, which does not see this as a production that is relational, but instead focuses on the construction of a gender stereotype which acts as a norm, a gender norm, towards which individuals try to conform, and this is composed of character traits. And therefore violence could be a character trait that composes a specific, that constitutes a specific gender stereotype. As Messersmith has argued in the debate between these two perspectives, this is only part of the hegemonic masculinity model. It does not consider dynamic and relational character. There's an alternative perspective which is proposed by Jefferson and Hall, and this perspective basically argues that there's structural strain and individuals internalize this strain and then respond to it violently. What we see here in debates again is that this perspective does not recognize the structure of inequality, a gender structure of inequality. So this one-directional relationship between violence and masculinity is problematic. The other thing that I want to highlight is that violence itself is understood in a very, it's not discussed explicitly, and it seems to be understood in terms of direct violence. But how can we study this relationship between violence and masculinity? Well, in the case of Mexico, or in relation to Mexico, this is problematic, as these authors that I cited a while ago, just a second ago, accurately state. Because of the security situation, it's difficult to study this relationship in the field. What they propose, their solution, is to take a passive approach and, for example, collect information or collect data through online forums. Now, this is problematic as well, because in order to gain an understanding of meaning and intentionality firsthand, we need to be in the field and get an insight into the lived experience that's behind motives and the meaning of that's attributed to practices and space in this case. So my solution is that there's locations that do offer a potential that are not directly involved in the actual war between the state and the different organizations dedicated to drug smuggling. And nonetheless, there's that still hold an association to the violence. And these are lap dancing clubs. These are spaces that have been used for decades for the study of gender, but most of the studies have concentrated on dancers. When the attention has fallen on the customers, it tends to focus just on a very specific type of customer, which is the regular customer. And there's not much attention that has been given to the interaction among customers. For example, the homosocial element, which is also relevant for the production of masculinity. Additionally, these spaces hold an association to the war against organized crime in Mexico at the moment. And the reason is because during these 10 years, organizations connected to drug smuggling have targeted these spaces. And this has been documented in the media. There has been 70 attacks published uh, that have been surfaced publicly. And for example, out of those 70, 29 occurred in just one city, the city of Monterrey, where the research takes place. My research takes place. There's two cases that are particularly relevant, or that were particularly public, and it's one in the bar Matehuala, which left 22 people dead in 2011, and one in the bar Sabino Gordo in 2012. What made them particularly public was the way they were perpetrated, which was it involved a commando arriving with masks and high caliber rifles and targeting the customers directly and the male employees, particularly the waiters. At the moment, those places are not necessarily directly being targeted directly. So these are the spaces where it's possible, I think, to begin to delve into this connection between masculinity and violence in the context of the war against organized crime in Mexico. So during 3 months, I worked as a waiter in a lap dancing club in a working class district, a working class lap dancing club in a warehouse district in the city of Monterrey. Because of security reasons, my identity was only known by my gatekeeper. I took notes using keywords on the back of the order slips. I expanded those notes on the day after each shift using a voice recorder, and then after the end of the field work, I transcribed and did thematic analysis on this. Let me just quickly describe the setting. This is a space that restricts access to men. Women can only, or restricts access to women. Women can only come into the bar if they hold a health card, which is issued by the health authority. And basically what it does is it certifies that the bearer has been tested for sexually transmitted diseases, and it's got a defined validity. And the dancer that holds, or the person that holds this in the business, is understood to have permission or to be able to work as doing sex work. So these are spaces where there's sex work. And furthermore, there are spaces where employees do not receive, or they do not receive, the gross part of their income is not their salary. They work mainly through tips and commission. So there are three components that constitute the space. They are the element, they are the dancers, the customers, and the waiters. As the customer comes in, he has a set of needs and desires that he wants to fulfill, and he presents those needs and desires to the dancer, to the customer, to the waiter. Sorry, let me just say that again. Customer comes in, presents the needs and desires to the waiter. It's the waiter's job to work for the customer. He will receive tips for the service that he provides. And then, therefore, he occupies a subordinate position with respect to the customer. With respect to the dancer, he occupies also a subordinate position. There's a power differential that works against the waiter, because the dancer would only maximize her income if she provides a service for the customer in the private area, whereas if she chooses to stay with the customer and drink at the table, it will take longer to make an equivalent amount of money. And this would imply interaction with the customer, public, in the bar floor. So in this first moment of interaction, what we have is that there's a hierarchy in which the waiter occupies a subordinate position. But he knows three things, and there's a second moment of interaction. The three things that this waiter knows are the personnel that are employed in the bar. He has a personal connection with this personnel, and he can establish a link between customers and the personnel, specifically the security personnel, who are allocated to their roles in terms of their physical appearance. Additionally, the waiter knows that the customers associate these spaces with the violence, and therefore he knows that there are multiple possibilities of spaces that are available in the business, and he knows the attributes for the space that he works in, and he knows what areas inside the bar offer a relative degree of safety for the customer. So those would be the areas close to the walls, the areas close to the emergency exits, to the back of the bar where the customer is able to see what is happening, or the areas that are behind the corners that offer a certain degree of cover, visual because of the lighting, and physical. And finally, he knows that there's there's multiple types of customers, but they all fall within a continuum. And here I use two EMI categories, Piojo and Padrino. Piojo is the customer that wants to satisfy his needs and desires while spending the least amount of money, while the Padrino wants to satisfy those same needs and desires and will not stop himself from spending as much money as necessary. So when he begins this interaction in this second moment with the customers, he classifies the customers and begins to employ behaviors that he appropriates from the customers themselves, particularly the behavior of the host or the padrino. This is the man who, because he's not going to limit himself with respect to how much money he spends, he will make sure that there is drinks on the table, that there are dancers with his companions or with himself, that he is paying the DJ for songs, and in general that he is setting the mood for the bar. So the waiter will do the same, will use those same practices, and also use physical touch with the customers to try to reposition himself and occupy the same level. He does the same with the Piojo, and he also tries to push the Piojo to force him to tip more using the same strategies. And if he refuses, he can also marginalize him and move him towards those spaces or areas that do not offer that safety. That is something that is looked for by the customers. And with respect to the answers, well, now that he's established this relationship with the customers, he's able to define which dancers uh, will have more profit in a given night, more income, which dancers will be marginalized. So in effect, what we have is that this waiter, these men are able to construct, to appropriate behaviors from the customers and to use the meaning associated or attached to the space in order to reconstruct their position within the hierarchy. So that's one of my conclusions. The other part of my conclusion is that this one-dimensional relationship between violence and masculinity is problematic, and instead the evidence collected points to understanding violence as the vehicle through which masculinity as the vehicle through which individuals interact with violence and contextual factors. And finally, there's a need to expand our understanding of violence and have a more nuanced idea of the multiple arrays of or possible configurations of violence and how they can be employed in masculinity. Thank you.